From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
There's something really terrible and disgusting about that if that were the case. So we're going to have to see. We're going to get to the bottom of it, and there will be severe punishment.
Journalist Jamal Khashoggi entered the Saudi Arabian consulate in Istanbul, Turkey, nearly 2 weeks ago and was never seen again. Despite suspicion he was murdered inside, President Trump says he still opposes ending billions in weapons sales to the kingdom. We'll get response from longtime Saudi dissident Ali Al-Ahmed, who was a political prisoner in Saudi Arabia when he was 14 years old. He's now director of the Institute for Gulf Affairs in Washington, D.C. Then Amnesty International says immigration officials forcibly separated as many as 6,000 migrant families at the U.S.-Mexico border, far more than previously estimated. Now, as thousands continue to flee violence and seek asylum, Trump says he may resume the family separation policy. We'll get an update from ACLU lawyer Lee Gallant.
And that's exactly what the administration's plan was. Stop people from coming over here because the word would get out, you'll lose your children. And if you actually get here, even if you have a legitimate asylum claim, they want you to give it up so that you can see your children again. It's as bad as anything I've ever seen.
And we go to El Salvador, where thousands celebrate the canonization of Archbishop Oscar Romero, a champion for the poor and oppressed who was murdered by a U.S.-backed right-wing death squad in El Salvador in 1980.
It is wonderful that together with Pope Paul VI and the other new saints today, there's Archbishop Romero, who left the security of the world, even his own safety, in order to give his life, according to the gospel, close to the poor and to his people, with a heart drawn to Jesus and his brothers and sisters.
The Pope was speaking at the Vatican. We'll speak with human rights lawyer Matt Eisenbrandt, author of Assassination of a Saint, the plot to murder Oscar Romero, and the quest to bring his killers to justice. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Saudi Arabia will allow Turkey to search its consulate in Istanbul Monday afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after the prominent journalist and Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi entered the consulate in October 2nd, and has not been seen since. This news comes amidst mounting international demands that Saudi Arabia explain the shocking disappearance after Turkish officials accuse the Saudis of assassinating Khashoggi, dismembering him, and smuggling body parts out of the consulate. In an interview with CBS's 60 Minutes, President Trump said Saudi Arabia would suffer severe consequences if they were found responsible. But Trump repeatedly said over the weekend he opposes ending U.S. weapons sales to the kingdom, which he claims are worth $110 billion to U.S. companies.
Well, there are many other things we could do, but when we take away $110 billion of purchases from our country, that hurts our workers, that hurts our factories, that hurts all of our companies. You know, you're talking about 500,000 jobs. So we do that, we're really hurting our country a lot more than we're hurting Saudi Arabia.
Over the weekend, Dick Durbin, the Senate's #2 Democrat, called on Trump to cancel the U.S. arms deal with Saudi Arabia. Some Republicans appear open to the idea. This is Republican Senator Marco Rubio of Florida speaking on NBC's Meet the Press.
If this is proven to be true, there is going to be a response from Congress. It's going to be nearly unanimous. It's going to be swift, and it's going to go pretty far. And that could include arms sales, but it could include a bunch of other things as well.
Top executives at J.P. Morgan Chase, Ford, Uber, Viacom, the New York Times, and other companies have pulled out of a planned investors conference in Saudi Arabia next week, nicknamed Davos in the Desert. U.S. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin, whose department enforces U.S. sanctions, still plans to attend, despite criticism from Congress members and senators of both parties. We'll have more on the disappearance of Jamal Khashoggi after headlines. In Yemen, at least 19 people were killed and another 30 injured Saturday as a U.S.-backed Saudi-led airstrike struck a convoy of buses full of civilians fleeing an assault on Yemen's port city of Hodeidah. Among the dead, women and children, including 5 members of the same family. A similar U.S.-backed assault on Yemen in August killed 51 people, including 40 school children. The United Nations has warned the Saudi-led bombing campaign has brought 13 million people to the brink of starvation, as Yemen's food crisis could soon become the world's worst famine in a century. Back in the United States, President Trump is traveling to Georgia and Florida today to tour devastation left behind after Hurricane Michael hit the Florida Panhandle last week as one of the most powerful storms ever to strike the U.S. mainland. The hurricane left 13 people dead in Central America. The death toll in the U.S. has reached 19, with another 46 people missing and unaccounted for in Mexico Beach, Florida, where entire blocks of houses were flattened by the storm. On Sunday, President Trump once again questioned the overwhelming scientific consensus that human activity is driving global temperatures higher and leading to more powerful storms. This is Trump being questioned by Leslie Stahl in his CBS 60 Minutes interview.
Do you still think that climate change is a hoax?
Look, I think something's happening, something's changing, and it'll change back again. I don't think it's a hoax. I think there's probably a difference, but I don't know that it's man-made. I will say this. I don't want to give trillions and trillions of dollars. I don't want to lose millions and millions of jobs. I don't want to be put at a disadvantage.
Last week, a UN-appointed panel of climate scientists warned in a landmark report that humanity only has a dozen years to mitigate climate change or face global catastrophe, with severe droughts, floods, sea level rise, and extreme heat set to cause mass displacement and poverty. The Senate has confirmed the lawyer who defended oil giant BP from lawsuits over the 2010 Deepwater Horizon oil spill as the Trump administration's top environmental lawyer, Jeffrey Bossert Clark, was approved on a 52-45 vote Thursday after Democrats Joe Manchin and Claire McCaskill sided with Republicans to appoint him as Assistant Attorney General for Environment and Natural Resources. Clark has repeatedly challenged the science of climate change, calling it contestable. Tens of thousands of people marched in Paris and in other major cities across France Saturday, demanding meaningful action on climate change. Thousands more marched in Geneva, Switzerland. This is Greenpeace Switzerland spokesperson Matthias Schlegel.
Each time the climate gets warmer, even by 1/10 of a degree, it has a lot of consequences. For example, if the climate gets warmer by just 1.5 degrees, we can save certain glaciers in Switzerland. If it gets warmer by 2 degrees, we can't save any. If the climate gets warmer by just 1.5 degrees, we can save up to 1/3 of the ocean's coral reefs. If it gets warmer by 2 degrees, we can't.
In Somalia, a pair of suicide bombers struck in the southern Somali city of Baidoa on Saturday, killing 20 people and wounding 40 others. The militant group Al-Shabaab claimed responsibility for the blasts, which targeted 2 restaurants frequented by government soldiers. In Nigeria, a militia fighting Boko Haram has released 833 children from its ranks as part of a deal signed last year to end the group's recruitment of child soldiers. This comes as the International Committee of the Red Cross released an urgent appeal for 2 aid workers who are being held captive by Boko Haram and could be killed Monday, according to a deadline issued by the militant group. In the Gaza Strip, Israeli forces shot and killed 7 Palestinians Friday as they protested near Israel's heavily militarized separation barrier. Gaza's health ministry reported more than 250 others were wounded as Israeli troops opened fire with live ammunition on some 15,000 Palestinians who joined weekly Great March of Return protests. The latest deaths bring the number of Palestinians killed to over 200 since the protests began in March. In western Turkey, at least 22 migrants died and 13 others were injured Sunday after a truck they were riding in crashed through a barrier and landed in an irrigation canal. The migrants had reportedly arranged for traffickers to take them by boat to the nearby Greek island of Samos, where they hoped to apply for asylum in the European Union. In Germany, the party of Chancellor Angela Merkel suffered losses in Bavarian regional elections Sunday that saw big gains for the Green Party, while the far-right AfD, or Alternative for Germany Party, won enough votes to enter the state assembly for the first time. The election threatens Merkel's 13-year hold on power as German voters increasingly polarize over whether to allow in refugees and asylum seekers. The Bavarian elections came as nearly 250,000 people rallied in the German capital Berlin Saturday, protesting against racism, xenophobia, and the rise of the AfD party. At the Vatican, Pope Francis has named Salvadoran Archbishop Oscar Romero a saint, 38 years after he was murdered by a U.S.-backed right-wing death squad at the beginning of the brutal U.S.-backed war in El Salvador. Only weeks before his assassination, Romero wrote a letter to President Jimmy Carter calling on him to not provide military aid to the right-wing Salvadoran military government. In the Archbishop's final and now famous sermon, he made a direct appeal to Salvadoran soldiers to lay down their weapons.
In his name and in the name of our tormented people who have suffered so much and whose laments cry out to heaven, I implore you, I beg you, I order you, stop the repression.
The next day, Oscar Romero was fatally shot from a car at the church where he was giving Mass. We'll have more on Oscar Romero's canonization later in the broadcast with the author of Assassination of a Saint. Back in the United States, the Trump administration's considering plans to resume forcibly separating migrant children from their parents along the U.S.-Mexico border. On Friday, The Washington Post reported senior White House advisor Stephen Miller is advocating for tougher measures in response to thousands of people who continue to seek asylum in the United States after fleeing violence in Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. One White House plan would see asylum-seeking families detained together for up to 20 days, after which parents would be forced to decide whether to stay detained for months or years while their immigration cases proceed, or to allow their children to be taken to a government shelter where their relatives or others could seek custody. We'll have more on Trump's family separation policy later in the broadcast. The New York Times reports President Trump's son-in-law and senior advisor, Jared Kushner, appears to have paid almost no federal income taxes over the past several years, even as his net worth quintupled to over $320 million. New York Times reports the tax dodge appears to have been legal based on Kushner's claims of depreciation on millions of dollars of real estate holdings that, in fact, gained market value. Last year, the Republican-led Congress approved a sweeping tax bill that expanded benefits to real estate investors, including the Trump and Kushner families. A government accountability watchdog says White House Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders violated federal law when she posted a photo of rapper Kanye West on her official White House Twitter account. In the photo, Sanders is seen smiling as she poses next to West, who's wearing a red Make America Great Again hat. In March, the U.S. Office of Special Counsel said any official White House communication promoting Trump's signature campaign slogan is a clear violation of the Hatch Act, which restricts employees from using their official government positions for partisan political purposes. Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren has released a DNA test that provides strong evidence of partial Native American lineage in her family tree dating back 6 to 10 generations. Warren released the test results Monday, along with a video about her family heritage. The move comes in response to President Trump's mocking of Senator Warren's previous statements on her Native American heritage. Trump has repeatedly referred to her as Pocahontas, including as recently as last week. Last month, Senator Warren said at a town hall meeting she would, quote, take a hard look at a 2020 presidential run after the midterms. The Trump administration is considering new restrictions on free expression outside the White House that could see demonstrators forced to pay to hold protests. A proposal filed by Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke would see the National Park Service close 80% of the sidewalks around the presidential mansion, including barring protests along the sidewalk north of the White House, while requiring protest organizers to cover the cost of police and support services. Today, October 15th, is the last day open to public comment on the plan. Senate Democrats have agreed to a Republican plan to fast-track the approval of 15 of President Trump's nominees to lifetime appointments on federal courts. The agreement made in a closed-door meeting late Thursday between Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer and Republican Leader Mitch McConnell will allow vulnerable Senate Democrats to return to their home states to campaign for November's midterm elections. Critics say Democrats could have fought the nominations and forced 30 hours of debate on each candidate. In New York City, members of the white supremacist group known as the Proud Boys violently attacked people on a Manhattan street Friday night after attending a talk by the group's founder, Gavin McInnes. In video captured of the incident, dozens of members of the extremist group can be seen kicking and punching anti-fascist protesters while shouting homophobic expletives. The Southern Poverty Law Center classifies the Proud Boys as a hate group, and some of its members participated in the deadly Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville last August. And in Washington, D.C., Episcopal church leaders have interred the ashes of gay college student Matthew Shepard in the National Cathedral. In 1998, Shepard, who was just 21 years old, was lured from a Laramie, Wyoming bar, robbed for $20 cash, lashed to a fence, bludgeoned in the head with a pistol, and left to die on the prairie. His killing shocked the conscience of the nation and spurred the LGBTQ rights movement. In 2009, Congress passed the Matthew Shepard Act, which expanded hate crimes laws to cover those targeted over their sexual orientation. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Saudi Arabia will allow Turkey, they say, to search its consulate in Istanbul Monday afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after prominent journalist, Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi disappeared after entering the consulate October 2nd. He has not been seen since. This news comes amidst mounting international outcry that Saudi Arabia explained Khashoggi's shocking disappearance after Turkish officials accused the Saudis of assassinating Khashoggi, dismembering him, and smuggling his body parts out of the consulate. In an interview with CBS's 60 Minutes, Trump said Saudi Arabia would suffer severe consequences if it was found responsible, but he has repeatedly said he opposes ending U.S. weapons sales to the kingdom, which he claims are worth $110 billion to U.S. weapons manufacturers.
There's a lot at stake, and maybe especially so because this man was a reporter. There's something, you'll be surprised to hear me say that, there's something really terrible and disgusting about that if that were the case. So we're going to have to see. We're going to get to the bottom of it, and there will be severe punishment.
The Saudi Foreign Ministry has responded to Trump's threats, saying if it, quote, receives any action, it will respond with greater action. The Saudis deny Khashoggi was killed in their consulate. Over the weekend, Dick Durbin, the Senate's #2 ranking Democrat, called on Trump to cancel the U.S. arms deal with Saudi Arabia. Some Republicans appear open to the idea. This is Republican Senator Marco Rubio of Florida speaking on NBC's Meet the Press.
What I do think is shocking is if, in fact, he was lured into a diplomatic facility, murdered, his body chopped up, and that they sent a group of people down there to carry this out. That would be an outrage. It would be an atrocity, and there would be a swift response, certainly from Congress.
Top executives at J.P. Morgan Chase, Ford, Uber, Viacom, the New York Times, and other major companies have pulled out of a planned investors conference in Saudi Arabia next week, nicknamed Davos in the Desert. But U.S. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin, whose department enforces U.S. sanctions, has not announced plans to pull out. This comes as the United Nations reports Yemen could face the worst famine in 100 years if the U.S.-backed Saudi-led coalition does not halt airstrikes. 3/4 of Yemenis, some 22 million people, are dependent on international aid, with an estimated 8.4 million people on the brink of starvation. For more, we go to Washington, D.C., where we're joined by Ali Al-Ahmed, a Saudi dissident. He's the founder and director of the Institute for Gulf Affairs, was a political prisoner himself in Saudi Arabia when he was just 14 years old, the youngest political prisoner at that time. We welcome you back to Democracy Now! Can you start off by talking about what we know at this point? I mean, what is public knowledge, what Washington Post, New York Times, Al Jazeera, the Turkish government has talked about so far is that on October 2nd, Jamal Khashoggi goes into the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. He had originally gone into the Saudi embassy in Washington, D.C. He was told to go to the one in Turkey. He was applying for marriage papers. His fiancée is Turkish. She waited outside for him in Istanbul. He went to the Turkish consulate. They told him to come back a week later. He flew out, went to a meeting, a conference in London, flew back. And it was then on October 2nd, as she waited outside and would wait for many, many hours that day outside the consulate, he walked inside. That is the last time we have seen video, closed-circuit TV, of Jamal Khashoggi. Talk about what is known after that point, Ali Al-Ahmed.
What we have known from the Turkish sources, and that these are my sources close to the government and close to the investigation, is the person I spoke to is the person who actually heard the audio of the murder, and he said that everything is clear. And the Turkish government was supposed to release it, but they're maybe negotiating with the Saudis. And it shows the collection of videos and the audio specifically shows the Mr. Khashoggi was killed just hours after he entered the consulate and then dismembered. And the audio shows who actually did the work or this gruesome act, this ISIS-style murder. And then the body parts were distributed in different bags and then moved to the house of the consulate and other places. And maybe some were taken out of the country as well. So you are looking at very convincing evidence of this murder happening inside the Saudi consulate, with the knowledge of the consular himself and those 15 Saudis who flew in on Saudi royal jets to carry the work, and they did not cover their tracks very they didn't try. They wanted this message to be known. They wanted to the world and their followers specifically, given that Mr. Khashoggi was a loyalist and continued to be a supporter of the monarchy. He was only critic of the crown prince. They wanted to send this gruesome message that if you oppose us, if you criticize us, we will do this to you in public. Remember, in Saudi Arabia, every week, the Saudi government carries out these public executions that they don't need to do in the street, but to cut people and behead them in the street is intended to spread fear among the population. And what happened to Mr. Khashoggi is just another example. It's almost a public beheading of a loyalist turned critic to scare those loyalists in the palace from doing the same. And that message is intended, and premeditated murder of Khashoggi is intended to do that effect. And the West and the international community in general has enabled this by supporting this dictatorship for 60 years. And this is the result, what you have.
So
what you see. Yes.
I wanted to go to the specifics of what you were saying. The Washington Post reporting the Turkish government told U.S. officials it has audio and video evidence that Khashoggi, in English, Jamal Khashoggi, is how it's pronounced here in the U.S., was killed inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. Officials saying the recordings confirm a Saudi security team detained Khashoggi as he walked into the consulate October 2nd before killing him and dismembering his body. The full audio and video recordings have not yet been released. One person with knowledge of the audio recordings told the Washington Post, "You can hear his voice and the voices of men speaking Arabic. You can hear how he was interrogated, tortured, and then murdered." The Washington Post has also reported, based on U.S. intelligence intercepts, the Crown Prince had directly ordered an operation to lure Khashoggi back to Saudi Arabia. The Turkish government has accused Saudi Arabia of flying 2 planes into Turkey, carrying a 15-man assassination squad to carry out the murder. One of the Saudi men was reportedly a forensic expert known for pioneering rapid and mobile autopsies. Turkish officials say the men used a bone saw to dismember Khashoggi's body before smuggling body parts out of the consulate. According to the Washington Post, at least 7 of the other 15 Saudi men have ties to the Saudi military. The planes then left Istanbul within 8 hours of Khashoggi entering the consulate, one of them going through Egypt back to Saudi Arabia. The significance of this, Ali.
Yeah, the one flew through Egypt and one flew through the UAE. Let's remember, in the region, UAE, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia are allies against Qatar and against Turkey. So there is already sort of 2 sides of the story here. So the Saudi, Egyptian, Emirati alliance has a problem with Turkey. Turkey hosts dissidents from these countries, especially from Egypt, where they even have TV stations and so on. This has happened after the coup in Egypt in 2013. There is an intention to have this split and increasing clash with Turkey, with these countries, and I think that's why they chose Turkey. You are absolutely right. My information so far indicates that Mr. Khashoggi, who lives in Washington, did try to get these papers done in the Washington, and he could have in normal circumstances, but he was told to go to Turkey, and that was, that indicates that the embassy here and the ambassador here is somewhat involved in this murder, and that's why I don't think the U.S. government should let him come back again. This was a plan that took a while. They thought about it, but the kill team here was connected to Mohammed bin Salman, because 2 of his bodyguards are part of that team that killed, and one of them actually is the person who cut up the body. There are 2 of them who did the cutting. One of them is MBS's own bodyguard.
I want to read from an op-ed Jamal Khashoggi's fiancée, Hatice Cengiz, wrote for the New York Times. In it, she writes, "If we have already lost Jamal, then condemnation is not enough. The people who took him from us, irrespective of their political positions, must be held accountable and punished to the full extent of the law. In recent days, I saw reports about President Trump wanting to invite me to the White House. If he makes a genuine contribution to the efforts to reveal what happened inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul that day, I will consider accepting his invitation." And you have Saudi Arabia most recently on Twitter congratulating the Trump administration for not jumping to any conclusions and awaiting their own investigation. Then, Ali Al-Ahmed, you have the very close relationship between the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, many call MBS, and the senior advisor to President Trump, Jared Kushner, who some, I understand, in the region call the Crown Prince, MBS, and the Clown Prince. If you can talk about that, and whether the United States had information that they should have released because Khashoggi was a resident in the United States to him about threats to him by the Saudi regime, their close ally.
Yeah, yes, the U.S. Definitely had that information and did not share it with him, and they bear part of the responsibility because the man is dead and in a horrific manner, and those people here sitting in Washington knew something was being planned. And I'm afraid that there is a desire sometimes in circles in Washington to have these things done, because, you know, they don't want, and I was told that many times, we don't want to complicate our relationship with Saudi Arabia. Why are you issuing this report? Why are you saying these things? Because that makes it hard for us. I mean, that's the, you know, Mr. Khashoggi was not working for the U.S. government, and that's my reaction to them. It's like, I don't work for you. I can write whatever I want. If it bothers you, you know, tough luck. And I think there should be an investigation in the fact that he was not told about these plans, and his walking and trusting the Saudis was a big mistake. Unfortunately, the last mistake of his life. And you cannot trust the Saudis. They have done this before, and they will do it again. And the international community, the American enablers of the House of Saud, must apologize and must do something to rectify their past decades of support. I know some people in Washington and around the United States who supported the Saudi monarchy and pretend the Saudi monarchy is just pure nice people, are part of this crime and other crimes the Saudis are committing in Yemen, the worst humanitarian catastrophe, the starvation of the Yemeni people, the killing of tens of thousands of Yemeni children. That is more outrageous than the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, and it should receive the attention. I think the American people have an opportunity to show their true nature by making sure their government is not supporting the war in Yemen and not oppressing and supporting this oppressive absolute monarchy. Americans, you removed an absolute monarchy to build the United States of America. Please think about that when you know, when you talk about my people who are being oppressed by an absolute monarchy that is even more regressive than the British monarchy that took over this land hundreds of years ago.
I want to thank you very much for being with us. What do you think will be the next step, Ali Al-Ahmed? I mean, if the Saudi government is conducting the investigation, what prevents them from saying anyone did it that they want to blame it on? The Turkish government conducting the investigation, what do you think would be an independent investigation? And what do you think is the most important move for the U.S. government to make? Not only the Trump administration, but right now Congress. We just interviewed Ro Khanna, who is a Silicon Valley Congress member, leading one of those, along with Bernie Sanders, leading the charge to stop funding the Saudi regime in its war against Yemen. We have our headline just today. In Yemen, at least 19 people killed, another 30 injured in the U.S.-backed Saudi-led airstrike. This time, a convoy of buses full of civilians fleeing an assault on Yemen's port city of Hodeidah. What would be the most important move right now?
I think the most important point now is to target the Saudi senior leadership with sanctions. We don't want an Iraq-style sanctions that kills the Iraqi people and to kill our people. We want sanctions that targeted sanctions against MBS.
It's interesting you should raise that, because Steve Mnuchin, whose department is in charge of that, Treasury Secretary, has still not said that he will not go to the Davos in the Desert conference, which is very important for Saudi Arabia's prestige next week, despite many corporations, because enormous pressure was put on them, pulling out of this conference.
No, we have to American people can pressure those companies that are supporting. You know, when Mohammed bin Salman came to the United States, he met with whom? With the Bloomberg and the Zuckerberg and Bill Gates and those people who basically whitewashed a dictator, and they played into his hand, or they supported him to make these crimes in Yemen and killing Mr. Khashoggi and other crimes. So it is important to pressure the private sectors to pull out from Saudi Arabia and supporting MBS as a dictator. It must be weakening. We must weaken the monarchy, and America really, honestly, should rethink the Saudi monarchy. Why do we have to? Some reporters said, "Oh, maybe MBS is bad. We get another prince." That's not the progressive. It's an American actually to suggest a dictator in place of another dictator. It's disgusting. So we must really throw everything at the Saudis, because they have caused you 9/11, and they will cause you greater problems if they stick around. So really, anything you can do pressure the Saudi monarchy. They are the problem. It is the monarchy that is the problem, not our people. That's why they should be targeted with sanctions, with freezing their assets, because the money that they have given to Americans, this is stolen money from the coffers of the people of my country. So anybody in America who gets paid from Saudi princes and the Saudi government, that's stolen money from the people of that country who suffer greatly under that monarchy.
Ali Al-Ahmed, I want to thank you for being with us. Saudi dissident, founder and director of the Institute for Gulf Affairs. He was, at the time, the youngest political prisoner in Saudi Arabia, arrested and imprisoned when he was 14 years old. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, is President Trump planning to once again separate children from their parents when they come across the border? We'll speak with the ACLU's Lee Gallant. Stay with us.
Chilenos, Centroamérica, vamos todos juntos, señores. Sumutu Liga Aba, Califuna.
Despierto sonriendo pensando en ella y eso me trae más felicidad. Viene otro día, nueva conquista, el corre camino ni me va a parar. Parece mentira, caricatura para la pantalla, pero esto es real.
I Saw the Stars by Rebel Diaz, featuring Rolando Chichi Sosa. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. The Trump administration is reportedly considering plans to resume its policy of forcibly separating children from their parents along the U.S.-Mexico border, even as the full number of people torn apart the last time it carried out the widely condemned practice remains unclear. A new report by Amnesty International suggests immigration officials separated some 6,000 families between April and August, a far higher number of children and parents torn apart than previously thought. On Friday, The Washington Post reported senior White House advisor Stephen Miller is advocating for tougher measures in response to thousands of parents with children who continue to seek asylum in the United States after fleeing violence in Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. Miller said the separations were an effective deterrent. On Saturday, President Trump said he agreed.
If they feel there's separation, in many cases, they don't come. But also, in many cases, you have really bad people coming in and using children. They're not their children. They don't even know the children. They haven't known the children for 20 minutes, and they grab children, and they use them to come into our country. You got some really bad people out there. We're doing an incredible job. But the one thing I will say, the country is doing so well economically and every other way that more people want to come in than ever before.
Trump administration officials are now considering plans to detain asylum-seeking families together for up to 20 days, then force parents to choose to either stay detained together for months or years while their immigration case proceeds, or allow their children to be taken to a government shelter where their relatives or others can seek custody. This comes as an Associated Press investigation has revealed parents who are deported from the U.S. after being separated from their children may lose their children to adoption without their knowledge. The AP found holes in the system that allow for state judges to put children of deported Central American immigrants in the custody of U.S. families without notifying the parents. Meanwhile, a tent city in the desert outside El Paso, Texas, that was set up to hold migrant children has expanded its capacity by nearly 10 times since it opened in June and now has the capacity of nearly 4,000 beds. For more, we're joined by Lee Gallant, Deputy Director of the ACLU Immigrant Rights Project, the lead lawyer on the ACLU's national challenge to the Trump administration's family separation practice, also presented the first challenge to President Trump's travel ban order, known as the Muslim ban. His argument resulted in a nationwide injunction. Welcome back to Democracy Now!
Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you with us. We've been trying for a while. I know you've been traveling back and forth around the country, particularly in California, where you were intimately involved with the negotiations around getting these kids back together with their parents to meet the judge's deadline.
Right.
But many were not brought back
We
together.
still haven't got them all back. And
What are the numbers?
You know, the numbers are shifting because the government's numbers are shifting. We believe there is somewhere between 100 and 200 kids who still need to be reunited. And that's the crazy thing about it, is that they're talking about a new family separation policy, haven't even got all the children back together from the first separation policy. These kids are so traumatized. Little children are going to be potentially permanently traumatized, and now they're talking about it having new family separation. There is going to be such an outcry, just like there was the first time, maybe bigger. We'll be back in court. I mean, I cannot believe that they're actually talking about another family separation.
How is it possible to do it? I mean, after you have the judges ruling they have to be reunited, isn't this defying the courts?
Well, so what they're going to do is tweak it a little bit and say, this is different. Whatever they want to call it, we'll be back in court.
And what about Amnesty's numbers saying, in
Right.
fact, 6,000 families were
Right.
separated?
We have been concerned for a while that there may have been more families separated than the government was revealing. I don't know whether Amnesty's numbers are exactly correct or not. We'll have to see. What we're waiting for is the government to respond. All the government's doing is sort of categorically denying and saying it's inaccurate. We need more specifics, and we will keep pressing the government on those specifics and wait to see. We have no reason to distrust Amnesty's numbers, but we'd like to see the government respond specifically to them.
So you talk about, for example, several hundred
Right.
children right now. So where are they?
They are in government facilities in the U.S. The biggest bulk, what we've been fighting now for about 8 weeks, is they deported roughly 400 parents without their children. So those parents are all over the world, largely in Central America. So we have been trying to track those parents, to find them, to ask them, what do you want to do? These are your legal options. And I was in Guatemala a few weeks ago talking to some of the parents. It's an agonizing decision because the government's saying we won't bring the parents back. We're going to still try and get the parents back. But if they can't come back, they're having to make this brutal decision. Do I leave my child in the U.S. to pursue asylum and keep them safe, or do I bring them back and reunite them? And about 2/3 of the parents are leaving their children in the U.S., which goes to show you just how dangerous it is there. And conservatives are saying, well, look, these parents don't even care about their children. They're abandoning them. Nothing could be further from the truth. When I looked in these parents' eyes, they have such agony making this decision, but they say to me, I can't bring my child back here. It's just too dangerous. I'm old. My life's over. If I'm killed, but I can't bring my child back here.
I want to go to a top Health and Human Services official who told lawmakers at a Senate Judiciary Committee hearing that he'd repeatedly warned the Trump administration against separating immigrant families at the border. This is Jonathan White, commander of the Public Health Service Commission Corps, a branch of HHS. White referred to ORR, O-R-R, which stands for the Office of Refugee Resettlement.
During the deliberative process over the previous year, we raised a number of concerns in the ORR program about any policy which would result in family separation due to concerns we had about the best interest of the child, as well as about whether that would be operationally supportable with the bed capacity we had.
During the hearing, Connecticut Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal also questioned Jonathan White about the psychological impact of separating children from their parents.
Separation of children from their parents entails significant risk of harm to children.
Well, it's traumatic for any child separated from his or her parents. Am I correct? I say that as a parent of 4 children.
There's no question that separation of children from parents entails significant potential for traumatic psychological injury to the child.
Despite Jonathan White's testimony, a top official with ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, tried to defend the Trump administration's practice of separating kids from their parents, comparing the child detention facilities to summer camp. This is Matthew Albence, head of enforcement and removal operations for ICE.
I think the best way to describe them is to be more like a summer camp. These individuals have access to 24/7 food and water. They have educational opportunities. They have recreational opportunities, both structured as well as unstructured. There's basketball courts, there's exercise classes, there's soccer fields that we put in there.
A veritable summer camp.
Right. I think when we see the administration's own kids going to those summer camps, we'll know that they're really summer camps. But I'm so glad you played that clip of Commander White talking about the trauma, because in some ways, it's just starting, or the next phase is just starting. These kids are so badly, and the government's doing nothing to provide trauma relief. We are going to try to get doctors to see all these children pro bono. But the children, I mean, when I talked to a mother who had a 4- and 10-year-old separated, the 4-year-old just keeps asking her, now that they're reunited, are they going to come and take me away again? I mean, that's the vulnerability that's set in for all these children.
The government's trying to stop or expand the 20-day limit on parents and kids that are imprisoned.
Right. So what they're basically saying is, oh, you have a choice. You can keep your child with you in essentially immigration jail, or you can lose your child and let your child go out. I mean, that's no choice at all, right? And so the government knows very well they have another choice, which is to release the family under supervision, even if they want to take the harsh step of putting ankle bracelets on. The Trump administration had banned the Obama administration's use of a program that was 97% effective in assuring appearance, and now they're saying the only choice we have is to keep them in immigration jail or to separate. That's absolutely wrong. They can release these asylum-seeking families under supervision.
What do they face? You were in Guatemala. What are these kids and families facing? Why a parent would make the excruciating decision to remain separated from their child because they fear for their child's lives?
I mean, absolutely. So take this one father we went to see. We said, we want to come see you. We'll see you anytime during the day. He said, I can't get off work. We said, fine, we'll come at night. He said, no, the gangs closed down the town, have a curfew. I'm not allowed out of my house. You certainly can't come here. I mean, that's the kind of danger these families are in. What parent would willingly give up their child? They are making the kind of decision that no parent should ever have to face.
So you were in San Diego a lot, negotiating with the government.
And in court, right.
And in court, trying to meet this, make the government meet this deadline to release the children, the first set under 5 and then the others going up into their teen years. What wasn't the government giving you, and what have they even admitted now they didn't, when it came to giving information that would connect the parents from their kids? Information, in fact, they had, but said, you go look for it yourself.
Exactly. So it was like pulling teeth every single step. So the first step was, look, we don't have, they actually said in court, we don't have a budget item to bring the kids back to their parents. They had a budget item, of course, to separate them. The judge said, absolutely not. These parents are not paying to get their own children back. Then when we said we can't find these parents without information, they said, no, you go find them. The judge said, absolutely not. It turns out that they had phone numbers for the parents. We're driving around Central America looking for the parents. They were sitting on the phone numbers. Finally, we have the phone numbers. We are calling the parents. All but 10 of the parents, at least as of the last report, have been reached, but only because we have had to do this legwork.
What has to happen now, Lee?
Well, I think all the children have to come back. We'd like to see the children get relief. We'd like to see the children get fair asylum proceedings, and we certainly don't want to see more separations, and we don't want to see a substitute for family separations be long-term indefinite detention of these families. The medical community has said if you detain these families, it will cause severe harm to the children, long-term detention. We don't put 4-year-olds in long-term detention in this country.
I saw Ivanka Trump interviewed. She said the family separation was the low point of the presidency. She's not just the president's daughter, but she is a senior advisor to the president. And now the president, once again, even with hundreds of children still separated from their parents, saying that they're going to separate them again.
Yeah, it's remarkable. I mean, anybody who was opposed to it hopefully spoke out at the time. I mean, people need to speak out in real time and stop it, not after the fact. I cannot believe that the administration is thinking about going back to this. I mean, this is the only place the administration has ever pulled back, and that's because of the public outcry. I'm urging the public to have that same outcry if they try it again. That's what's critical. The ACLU will be in court, but the public outcry is critical.
One of the things that President Trump continually said is they've got to come over the border legally. We went to the border. We went on the bridges. Mothers with their 2-year-old children, day after day in the hot, blazing sun, not being allowed, which was the Trump administration being illegal, breaking federal and international law, not allowing them into the country.
Oh, absolutely. And so, first of all, The lead plaintiff in our case presented herself lawfully at the border, did not cross illegally, and that she had her child taken and many others. So the narrative they were putting out was simply wrong. But now they've said go to a port of entry. You're absolutely right. The lines are endless. People are sitting out there with their little children. Ultimately, they have no choice but to cross where they can choose. They're not going to sit out there for a month with a 3-year-old. It's absolutely horrendous what's going on.
Who would force the administration to engage in lawful activity? Who can do that?
I think it's going to have to be the courts, but I think like all big civil rights cases, it has to have that public outcry around it. There has to be this atmosphere. And I think what you saw in the summer is the public pushing back, not just liberals and Democrats, but conservatives and Republicans saying, look, in the United States, we just don't do this to children. If the administration's going to do it again, we have to see that public outcry again. We have to.
Lee Gallant is Deputy Director of the ACLU Immigrants' Rights Project, lead lawyer for the ACLU's national challenge to the Trump administration's family separation practice. He presented the first challenge to President Trump's travel ban order, known as the Muslim ban, his argument resulting in a nationwide injunction. This is Democracy Now! Oscar Romero, the Archbishop of El Salvador, has been declared a saint by the Pope. We'll go to British Columbia to speak with the author of Assassination of a Saint, what happened on March 24th, 1980 in El Salvador, the killing of an archbishop, and what was the U.S. role in that. Stay with us.
A martyr's death is a grace of God that I do not believe I deserve. But if God accepts the sacrifice of my life, let my blood bring liberty. Let my blood be a seed of freedom. Let my blood be a seed. Let my blood be a seed of freedom. Let my blood be a seed. Let my death, if accepted by God, be for my people's liberty.
Romero by The Project. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman. We end today's show with the canonization of Salvadoran Archbishop Oscar Romero. Archbishop Romero was a champion for the poor and oppressed who was murdered by a U.S.-backed right-wing death squad March 24th, 1980. It was the beginning of the brutal U.S.-backed war in El Salvador. On Sunday, Pope Francis made Romero a saint, along with Pope Paul VI and 5 others, wearing the blood-stained rope belt that Romero wore when he was assassinated. Pope Francis, who's originally from Argentina, was praising Romero for disregarding his own life to be close to the poor and to his people.
It is wonderful that together with Pope Paul VI and the other new saints today, there's Archbishop Romero, who left the security of the world, even his own safety, in order to give his life, according to the gospel, close to the poor and to his people, with a heart drawn to Jesus and his brothers and sisters.
Only weeks before his assassination, Archbishop Romero wrote a letter to President Jimmy Carter calling on him not to provide military aid to the right-wing Salvadoran military government. Then, in the Archbishop's final and now famous sermon, he made a direct appeal to Salvadoran soldiers to lay down their weapons.
In his name and in the name of our tormented people who have suffered so much and whose laments cry out to heaven, I implore you, I beg you, I order you, stop the repression.
The next day, a driver and a gunman pulled up in a red Volkswagen Passat outside of the church where Archbishop Romero was giving Mass. The gunman fired a single shot from the car, killing Romero. Romero's murder was one of the most shocking of the long conflict between a series of U.S.-backed governments and leftist rebels, in which thousands of dissidents and everyday civilians in Salvador were killed by right-wing and military death squads. Activists continue to call for justice in Romero's assassination. Last year, a Salvadoran judge reopened the case. For more, we're joined by Matt Eisenbrandt, human rights lawyer, author of Assassination of a Saint, The Plot to Murder Oscar Romero and the Quest to Bring His Killers to Justice. The book won the 2017 Juan y Mendez Book Award for Human Rights in Latin America. Matt Eisenbrandt served on the trial team that brought the only court verdict ever reached for Romero's murder. Welcome to Democracy Now, Matt. It's great to have you with us, joining us from British Columbia. Can you talk about what happened to Oscar Romero? Who is responsible for his assassination?
Romero was killed by a death squad that was headed by Roberto Davison, who was a very important military intelligence figure in El Salvador in the late 70s, who was backed by some of the wealthiest families in El Salvador, who were very outspoken against Archbishop Romero for his condemnation of the repression that they underwrote in El Salvador. And the murder occurred, as you were just saying, a day after Romero's most strident call in his homily to stop the repression. And so this death squad carried out his murder, and Roberto Davison, rather than ending up in jail, ended up becoming one of the most powerful political figures in El Salvador throughout the 1980s.
Davison's relationship with the U.S. government and with the School of the Americas at Fort Benning, Georgia, Matt Eisenbrandt?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a long history of U.S. government training of Salvadoran military officials. Davison did attend an International Police Academy in Washington, D.C., and there was some connection to the School of the Americas. Now, his training, as far as I know, was not as extensive as some of the other connections to even higher-ranking Salvadoran military figures. But certainly, he did have some connections to the U.S. government, and he and his sort of political backers had close connections to politicians and political groups in Washington, D.C. And it's also important to note that that the death squad that Davison headed and other death squads in El Salvador occurred as a result of U.S. policy starting back in the 1960s of training Latin American militaries. And so there is, U.S. responsibility in terms of building up that structure that led to the death squad and the just horrific violence that occurred in El Salvador at that time.
Matt Eisenbrandt, your response to the Pope making Oscar Romero a saint and what this means as thousands celebrated in El Salvador.
Yeah, it's a tremendously important moment for El Salvador, and for Romero's canonization took decades, and for it to finally happen and for him to be declared a saint is it cannot be overstated how important this is for El Salvador, and just really a tremendous moment. It would be regardless for El Salvador, but especially after decades of resistance to him being declared a saint, both in the Vatican and in El Salvador, for his cause to have finally overcome all of these challenges is tremendously important. But I also do make the note that as big an achievement and as important a day as it was yesterday for El Salvador, there's still a second piece, which is justice for his killers. And to this point, other than the civil lawsuit that I was involved in the United States against one of his killers, nobody has been held accountable for his killing, and no one has gone to jail in El Salvador or even been put on trial there. So there's the second, as important as the canonization was, there's now the second piece that has to be achieved after all these years.
We're going to do part 2 of this discussion, posted at web exclusives at democracynow.org. So Matt Eisenbrandt, please stay with us, author of Assassination of a Saint. I'll be speaking at the Metrograph Theater in New York tonight, and in Florida, in Gainesville, as well as other places this weekend. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.